Hello and welcome back to the Land and Climate podcast. I'm Bertie Harrison-Broninsky, and today I'm talking to Alden Wicker, a journalist, sustainable fashion expert, and editor-in-chief of Eco Cult. We're going to be discussing her 2023 book, To Die For: How Toxic Fashion is Making Us Sick, and How We Can Fight Back.
In Shein and Zaful, high levels of lead and high levels of phthalates were found in children's clothing. There have been tests that have found things like cadmium in cheap jewelry. Restricted carcinogenic azo dyes have been found even in European clothing where it's not supposed to be, where it's specifically restricted.
Alden begins the book by saying that it wasn't until 2019 that she learned that people could become sick just by wearing clothes, despite the fact that she'd already been reading and writing about eco-friendly fashion and organic products for a long time by then. So I began our conversation with this point, asking how she learned about the toxic chemicals that clothing is treated with.
It was not something that was on my radar until I got a call from a radio show. They said Delta airline attendants were suing Lands' End, who had made their uniforms, saying they made them very, very sick. And the symptoms that they were describing, it would usually start out with a cough or maybe a skin burn or a rash or puffy eyes. And then they started linking some more amorphous health effects, extreme fatigue, brain fog, racing hearts, all of these different things to wearing the uniforms or being on the plane around their colleagues who are wearing the uniforms. And so I didn't really know what was going on because I had never heard from a reputable source that clothing could have toxic chemicals in it. There had always been stuff about, you should buy organic cotton because they use pesticides in the fields, and maybe those pesticides could maybe make it to the final product. But this was something completely new. And so I started looking into it, and I wanted to find out what was in these uniforms. And the first thing I found out is that this wasn't the first time. It had happened at Alaska Airlines. It was happening at American Airlines, where there were some lawsuits. And it was also happening at Southwest. And these are different airlines, different uniform makers in 3 of the instances. And so clearly something was happening. And then I also wanted to find out, okay, are these chemicals, whatever is making these airline attendants sick, are they also making regular people sick as well? And the answer to that question was yes, just in more subtle and hard to track ways.
You talk about the airline workers story being a useful case study. And because you say, I think, quite an extreme event sometimes to really make people prove causation with certain incidents. Could you talk a bit more about that and why there's a kind of breakthrough element with that particular study and series of legal cases?
Exactly what you say is true. They are a really good case study because whenever they would get these new uniforms, which they would go from traditional wool suiting and cotton button-downs and silk scarves to these new high-performance synthetic uniforms. They would be synthetic blend, and they would have antifungal, anti-wrinkle, stain proofing, water resistant, just easy care, and then flame resistance as well for safety, because suddenly they're wearing these synthetic things that aren't naturally flame resistant like wool suiting is, like even cotton is. So they would get these, and they would do the official rollout, and they would all start wearing it on the exact same day. And then the reports would start rolling in to the airline or to the union about what was happening. So the acute reactions like skin burns and puffy eyes and everything. And then more attendants would slowly start to realize that they would be coughing or they would have brain fog while they were working. And then when they would have 3 days off, it would clear up and then they would go back to work. So they started talking to each other and it became really clear. And then there was a Harvard study where they had done a survey of a lot of different airline attendants just to see what kind of health problems they had. And so they went back to the Alaska airline attendants to see how those symptoms had changed after the introduction of the uniforms. And this study found that all of these different symptoms more or less doubled after the introduction of the uniform. So it was very clear that the uniforms were causing these acute health issues. And then Anecdotally, I've talked to airline attendants who, after having these initial acute reactions, have developed multiple autoimmune diseases. One of them developed skin cancer on her nipple. So there are long-term health consequences that haven't been studied in the same way, but these airline attendants attribute to having forced to wear these uniforms that were causing these health issues.
And I think I remember you saying that there's an additive quality to all these different chemicals being layered on top of each other on the same clothes, which means that even if each of them is under certain potentially safe or certainly legal limits, combined, they can end up having very different impacts. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. So currently in the United States, especially, we have these completely voluntary, often quite arbitrary, safe, I'm putting this in air quotes, safe limits on all of these individual type of chemicals. So if you have phthalates under a certain amount and you have BPA under a certain amount and you have PFAS under a certain amount, then it's okay. But everything I just talked about are endocrine disruptors, hormone disrupting chemicals. And also, researchers agree that there's no safe exposure limit to endocrine disruptors. I call them chaotic evil. They can do damage at very, very small amounts, especially to pregnant women, to kids. They stick around for a while. Their effects stick around for a while, and they can also be passed on from generation to generation. And so you have all these things in a uniform. You could have them in one piece of fabric, or you could have them in one uniform piece in the pocketing or in the lining. And then you have these uniforms where you're wearing all of these different pieces together. And so you're just layering this on top of layering. And then you have the stuff that comes from being on the airplane. Like you have flame retardants on the seats, and you have pesticides in certain countries sprayed on the bunk beds where these flight attendants are sleeping on long international flights. And then you have like these fume events where the smoke is coming in the cabin containing more of these same chemicals. And so you're getting exposed to all these different things. And so the current paradigm for how we're deciding what is safe and what is not safe, not lining up with real world conditions. And then on top of that, you have this situation where the airlines or the uniform makers are paying their own toxicology consulting firms to have these uniforms tested for a limited number of potentially hazardous chemicals, and then sharing not the full results or what they tested for with these attendants, but saying, we've had them tested, good news, they're safe, nothing to worry about here. But you can see how they'd be incentivized to not test for everything or declare something safe. And so these attendants are left out in the cold unless they have the advocacy of, maybe a union like AFA, but they're just being told, oh no, you're fine, when their bodies are clearly not able to operate in these conditions.
I was just interested to ask you to begin with. In the first couple of sentences of your book, you talk about how you aim to write the book without stoking unreasonable fear. Do you find that either kind of eye-rolling or panic is the first reaction of most people to these claims? And why do you think people are not more familiar with them? Because I think it is that shock value of not ever having heard about these things that probably introduces those kinds of reactions, right?
Yeah, I don't want the book to unnecessarily stoke fear. And I have heard that reaction. I think there's some people who dismiss the book without even reading it because, yeah, as you say, they've never heard about this. And I think the well has been so poisoned over the past 5 years by wellness misinformation. And there are a lot of snake oil people out there who want to make you afraid of everything in order to sell you a product. But the book is very heavily fact-checked, very heavily cited. And I was actually surprised by how much evidence I found and how much history there is of fashion containing hazardous chemicals and the people who stand to profit from dyes and fashion dismissing these concerns as unscientific. This goes all the way back to the late 1800s when dermatologists were saying, hey, people are showing up with striped rashes on their feet from striped socks with these newfangled dyes. And the Society of Dyers being like, oh, no, we need more evidence. What you're saying is not true at all. And so this has been really effectively hidden from the public for a really long time, or it comes up and then goes away. And the way that happens is when things get really egregious, the industry says, okay, well, we will voluntarily phase out use of this dispersed dye or this azo dye or mercury or lead or other heavy metals or phthalates, like all these things that have been used in fashion. We'll voluntarily phase them out. No need to worry. And that has kind of worked, except for the fact that fashion doesn't come with a complete ingredient list. So anything under 5% of the weight of the product or the textile doesn't need to be listed. 5% of the weight of a textile is a lot when it comes to some of these immunosensitizing or carcinogenic or reproductive toxic chemicals. I mean, some of these things can do damage at parts per billion or at least parts per million. And so people, regular folks, even if they know they have an allergy, even if they know they have a chronic health issue, even if they know that they want to avoid certain of these things because they're pregnant or they're in recovery from cancer or remission from cancer, there's no way for them to even pick out clothing or know that clothing comes with these things. So a lot of people have no idea that they're in there. And if they do, there's no way for them to avoid them. So I think that's one of the reasons why this has been so swept under the rug. And now we're in a situation where, in a time when 90% of clothing sold in the United States was made in the United States, if the industry is saying, yes, we've phased out these products, that could work. But now something like 98% of our clothing is made abroad. And even if it's sewn here, it's dyed abroad in these countries that have very, very poor regulations. And so we're in a situation now where some fashion brands are asking factories to test their products for hazardous chemicals before they send them over. Some are not. Of those that are, I mean, that's a system that can be very easily gamed. And I told it was being gamed by somebody in India who works at these companies, right? You can edit the PDF, the testing PDF. And so we're being asked to trust fashion brands, these factories abroad, these testing schemes that are corrupt and be gamed. And also a lot of these dyes and finishes have actually never been tested for human health effects. Some of them aren't even present in the literature. You know, I talked to Duke researchers and they said, we're looking at these house dusts and we're looking at textiles, and there are all these chemical signatures that we can't match to the literature. You know, we're not saying that all of them are dangerous, but we're saying we have no idea if they are safe because they're not even being recorded or being presented for testing, much less being tested in a way that would assure us that they're not having effects on our health.
I'm glad that you touched on the history of the fashion industry in this issue in that answer, because I thought that was something you did very well in the book, of navigating this contradictory aspect where on one hand there's a huge amount that's unresearched, untested, unknown, and on the other hand things are very much business as usual in the same way they've been for centuries. And you go all the way back to the 16th and 17th centuries and some of your kind of asides when you give other examples. Could you talk a little bit to that and maybe tell us a little bit about that history, and maybe tell us a little bit about some of the previous case studies and also some of the ways in which we're massively naive about what's happening today?
These companies like BASF, they were founded as dye manufacturers, and some of them still are dye manufacturers, but some of them now are just chemical companies. That's a really interesting thing that a lot of people don't know about chemicals in the industry. And there were reactions almost from the get. But even before these dyes were created, you had mercury in hats. So that's where you get the Mad Hatter. Also, they were using arsenic to brighten dyes. The first invention of green that was super, super popular just had arsenic in it. And doctors were saying that they were measuring levels of arsenic wafting off of these ball gowns. And people would have kind of crusty eyes coming out of these evening galas because all these women were being twirled around the dance floor in arsenic green dresses and wearing these arsenic green floral headdresses. And there were instances of the young poor women who were making these dying from being exposed to arsenic. And so the fashion industry for a very long time has been very clearly toxic. And a fun fact is that we didn't stop using mercury to make hats because it was outlawed. I think it was outlawed in Connecticut, and that's it. We did just because, top hats and made from rabbit fur went out of style and men don't wear them anymore. That's the only reason why. When people look back and say, oh, there's crazy people, they're using toxic chemicals, like we know better than that. Do we know better than that? And I don't think we do.
I think you've got some scary statistic at some point about, is it 40 to 60,000 chemicals used in America in fashion that are basically unknown as to their health effects along those lines. Most of the time you're talking about American context when you're speaking about kind of legal limits and when things are banned and not, right? But there's also a kind of narrative in your book of countries in the global south that are often now the center of production, maybe have the weakest limits. Stuff's improving in America, but it's still not as good as Europe. How much of a difference do these national differences really make? Are there countries that are really leading the way on these things? Is it a lot safer to buy clothes in Europe? It'd be interesting for our audience, I think, to know whether America is a lot worse than other countries. How much of an improvement are we really talking about with the EU?
Without a really large study that tests a bunch of different things and compares them, I can't say for sure how much safer Europe is to America. There are some clues, right? So Europe has banned over 30 chemicals specifically for use in textiles. And in the United States, we've only banned 3 chemicals and only in children's products. So there's that. California is doing God's work. They have Prop 65, which means you have to label products that have known hazardous chemicals in them. And I think a lot of people feel like, well, it's not doing anything. They just slap the label on everything. But that's not really true when it comes to bedding and clothing. Like clothing brands do not want to put this warning label on their product. So that's actually done a lot. There's been settlements to get, lead, cadmium, phthalates, etc. out of clothing because of Prop 65. And that has effects across the United States because no brand is going to sell something specially into California and not the rest of the United States. So that's good. But there also have been studies looking at clothing being sold into Europe and still finding these things that are supposedly restricted. It's just really hard to manage these millions of now small packages that are being ordered from places like Temu and Shein and Amazon and, whatever tiny little weird brand that you find on social media today. I would feel more comfortable buying clothing in Europe or buying clothing from European brands than from American brands, especially.
So do you feel like, obviously there are always going to be exceptions, but broadly the certification schemes do enforce the standards that they set? It's just that the problem is more that the standards aren't good enough and the chemicals aren't regulated enough to begin with.
There are several layers to this. In an ideal world, it would just be illegal to sell textile and clothing products with these hazardous or restricted substances, things like allergenic azo dyes or carcinogens or lead or cadmium, phthalates, BPA, all these different things. That's not the world we live in. So a lot of brands have turned to private certification schemes to assure themselves and the final customer that what they're selling is safe. I tell people that in the world we live in right now, looking for an Okotex label or a Blue Sign label is the best thing you can do to assure yourself that something is safe. Unfortunately, the GOTS organic label does not, it's counterintuitive, but through my research, I found that it doesn't actually assure the end consumer that something's safe. It's just a paperwork scheme. The dye house sends in paperwork and says, this is what we're using. Nobody ever checks that it's true. I've heard reports from friends and readers that they've had allergic reactions to certified organic textile products. So that's not really a good one. The problem is that they've gotten better since when I reported the book. Okotex allowed a certain amount of PFAS, which is that Teflon forever chemical that's reproductive toxic, carcinogenic. It's just really, really toxic. And they said, a certain amount is okay if you need that performance. And now they've moved beyond that and said none of it is okay. But they're still private schemes, right? They're completely voluntary. They're expensive. And a brand doesn't have to adhere to their standards. And so it's not ideal, but it's the best we have right now.
You've said earlier in this interview that you were surprised by how much research you did find and how much is out there. But you also talk in the book at several points, including right at the beginning, that you struggled to find academics who could speak candidly with you and in general perhaps struggled to get those authoritative interviews that would prove even the most skeptical reader. Why do you think it is that academics are so hesitant to speak on these issues, and perhaps media more generally, because books like yours are rare? We don't see a lot of this kind of discussion in news reporting or major media. Is it lobbying? Is there something else going on? Is science just not at the point where we can be confident about cause and effect?
I think there's some sexism in there. I've heard from researchers that including the word fashion in your proposal is a really good way to make sure it won't get funded. We're in a catch-22 loop where there's not a lot of good research. So the fashion industry is not seen as a serious area of research. And so we don't get any more research. Researchers that I spoke to eventually who had just recently gotten into this were either came into it sideways by accident. Someone like Dr. Graham Peasley, he's an astrophysicist, and he just was coming up with ways to test for elements like PFAS. And so when he started testing different things, he ended up getting sucked into this world where PFAS is on all these different uniforms. And so that became something where he is now this expert on the amount of PFAS that is found in, not just uniforms, but also fast food wrappers and such. Dr. Heather Stapleton got into this because she's a mom, and her own son had an allergic reaction to his synthetic sports t-shirt. And so she just happens to have access to world-class testing equipment. And that kicked off 5 years of looking into this. The woman who worked on this project to get her PhD, she has her own chronic health issues that made her interested in finding out about how environmental toxins are impacting people's health. And women are more likely to be impacted by autoimmune disease and other chronic health issues than men. Women also are exposed more to the toxins in fashion because we are pressured to have more and a wider variety of clothing. And so we're buying more new stuff and more toxic stuff because it's really hard to get high quality natural fiber fashion for everyday wear when, unlike men, we can't just wear the same pair of jeans and the same button down for the next 10 years. We have to have all this different stuff. And so the net result is that researchers are not looking specifically into fashion because of fashion being dismissed as a woman's issue, and chronic health issues being dismissed as psychosomatic and also a woman's issue. Another one, so I'm 37. I'm at the age where it seems like all of my girlfriends are going through IVF, which, I mean, it's a horrendous process. It's also horrendously expensive. And part of my book, I talk about endocrine disruptors, and I talk to a fertility doctor who advises her clients to try to detoxify their environment. It's one element of this process that they can control. And a lot of fertility doctors or clinics won't do that. They just say the only thing you have control over is the actual IVF process itself. And people are going through multiple rounds in order to have success and failing. And again, it's women who suffer through this process, and clinics are not incentivized to tell women about this thing that they do have control over, which is detoxifying their home. And even the doctors who are, like this doctor I interviewed, she said, I'd never heard about the fact that clothing can have phthalates and BPA in it, and this is going to be something I'm going to add.
I haven't asked you explicitly yet to lay out the scale of the problem in terms of health impacts for everyone and the chemicals that we do know about and what specific health impacts they likely cause. So I guess this is the scary bit of the interview for listeners, but also the chance to make that case for why this research should be happening, why this funding needs to be there. Could you, I know it's a huge thing to try and cover in one answer, but could you take us through some of the key chemicals and perhaps how prevalent these issues are and what the research that you've looked at is suggesting might indicate in terms of how widespread these issues are and how many of us are being affected by these things?
Sure. So I'll start with the presence of the chemicals in fashion and then additional research showing how they can get from fashion into our bodies. Again, there's not a ton of research and testing is very, very expensive. But every time researchers or advocates have tested products over the past 10 years, they've found things. So things that have been found in Shein and Zaful, high levels of lead and high levels of phthalates were found in children's clothing. There have been tests that have found things like cadmium in cheap jewelry, restricted carcinogenic azo dyes have been found even in European clothing where it's not supposed to be, where it's specifically restricted. BPA has been found in polyester spandex workout gear in several different rounds of testing by the Center for Environmental Health in California. PFAS continues to be found in outdoor products, even in Europe. Your hiking shoes, your raincoats, ski gear, snowboard gear. It's been found all over the snow or all in the snow in base camp for Mount Everest and around ski resorts because people are wearing it. We know that all of these things are there. Chlordane was found. It's a pesticide that has been banned in the United States, one of the few, since the 80s. It was found in American Airlines uniforms. It's incredibly, incredibly toxic. So we know these things are getting on there and in there, and they're in there for a few different reasons. One of them is that they're added on purpose to provide performance qualities, things like formaldehyde-based anti-wrinkle finishes or dyes, obviously added on purpose. PFAS is added for stain repellency and water repellency. You have things that are added because they're cheaper to use. So you have things like arsenic or other heavy metals added to brighten different colors, or they're just contaminated with these things accidentally because it's cheaper to source chemicals that are recycled from the mining industry or other industries. A lot of people don't know that a lot of these fibers are just plastic. Polyester is plastic. Nylon is plastic. Acrylic is plastic. Polyurethane, like vegan leather or PVC vegan leather, are plastic. PVC has phthalates almost always added to it for pliability. BPA is added to plastics for, again, pliability or other performance qualities. And then you can have pesticides added or contaminated because the fabrics are being stored in a warehouse somewhere or on a ship. There's lots of different reasons why they get on there. So how do these things get from our clothing into our bodies? Well, it used to be for a long time we were told it doesn't matter. We don't eat our clothing. That's not really true, especially if you're a baby. You definitely eat your clothing. But more and more research is showing is that we're ingesting microfibers and microplastics, that these things are finding their way into our house dust, where again, we can breathe them in, we can ingest them, especially if we have children, they're walking around, they're crawling around on the floor, they're putting their hands in their mouths. Our pets are ingesting these things. So they can find their way there. Also, there's more research coming out showing that when we sweat, our sweat can draw hazardous chemicals out of plastics and fibers onto our skin where they could potentially be absorbed. So we have all three different exposure routes: breathing, eating, absorbing, for all of the substances that are in our clothing.
And in terms of potential health impacts, you talk a lot about kind of exhaustion and fatigue, obviously like skin irritation from some things. You've mentioned a bit already, fertility.
Yeah. So as I said, we've connected some of the acute reactions to clothing, right? You put on a piece of clothing and it might take 3 days, but then you get a rash. Okay. Clearly that's happening. Some of the longer term issues are a little bit harder to connect the cancer and everything because we're wearing so many different things all the time that it's hard to connect it to a cancer or an autoimmune disease to one particular thing, unless you're wearing that thing as a uniform and, you can show that you were wearing across a population. That research hasn't been done yet. But you could potentially show that. Fashion is one of many things that we're exposed to during a day, but all of these things that I've named, you have carcinogens, you have heavy metals, you have endocrine disruptors. And so what I like to say to people is, if you are buying organic food or avoiding processed food, you should be buying natural and safe clothing as well. If you're struggling with eczema, or a family member struggling with eczema or psoriasis, don't forget, and your doctor's told you to go with fragrance-free detergents and avoid fragrance lotions, you should also be looking at what you're wearing as well and try to start swapping that out and see if that makes a difference.
I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of theory of change and how to reform some of these issues. I know it's a little bit of hope at the end of your book. You say that there are bans that are coming in the EU and the US, but you also suggest some specific policies that you think would work to help improve this issue, such as implementing taxes and tariffs on untested chemicals to fund research and requiring chemical companies to register all of the chemicals in use and share that research. Could you talk a little bit more about how you ended up with those conclusions?
Like I said at the beginning, I've been writing about fashion sustainability for over a decade now. And I don't see consumer education or consumer choice doing really much at all to make wide scale change, right? On the individual level, if you're worried about this, yeah, for sure. There are things you can do. You can buy natural fibers. You can avoid performance products that say they're anti-wrinkle or stain resistant. You can avoid ultra fast fashion brands like Shein or Amazon brands. But that's not going to make a dent in what's happening there, because the incentives, the financial incentives, are just too large and this system is too entrenched. I mean, we have a runaway train of Shein that is just going gangbusters. This is by all the people who are like, no, totally, I would buy more. I would pay more for sustainable fashion. And so I am a big believer in legislation. And yes, this is a really hard freight train to stop. And there are tweaks that we could make, and there are signs that we could change this. California and New York have both banned all types of PFAS in everyday apparel first, and then performance apparel after that. And so in a few years, it will be illegal to have PFAS in your clothing. And that's going to do a lot, because in order to get PFAS out of your clothing as a brand, you need to have a handle on your chemical management, which a lot of brands don't right now. I think PFAS is the new asbestos, honestly. I think that's where we're headed. So that's great. That's going to be a really big change. Other tweaks that could be made. We have legislation where any shipment to the United States that's under $800 is not tariff taxed or checked, which is incentivizing brands like Shein to ship package by package in, and it's favoring hyper fast fashion. There's been a lot of work to get rid of that de minimis standard or lower it to something more reasonable. If that happens, that's going to have a huge effect. So there's things that we can do. The chemical industry is incredibly powerful. This is true. They slapped a lawsuit on the EPA for saying that formaldehyde is carcinogenic at certain levels. They're going to fight any change tooth and nail. They're fighting in Europe. They've delayed some really needed legislation that would classify more things like PFAS as highly hazardous and regulate them in consumer products. So it's going to be a long battle. It's one worth fighting, because I don't want to live in a world where I can, quote unquote, choose to buy things with lead in them or not. And it's impossible for me as a regular consumer and not an expert to know what's in my consumer products. We're swimming in this sea of phthalate-free or paraben-free or BPA-free products that probably just have a different type of phthalate or a different type of bisphenol in them. And it's just impossible to shop your way out of this problem or protect yourself when they're so ubiquitous. We have a situation where now people in the industry are defending themselves against this PFAS legislation by saying, well, it's impossible to get it out or have a product with no PFAS because it's so ubiquitous that everything has a little bit of PFAS contamination, which is so bleak of an argument. It is so cynical. It's like, oh, well, now that PFAS is everywhere, like we shouldn't try to get it out of anything at any level, which is just ridiculous. So we do need widespread legislation to just start tamping down on this problem. People are like, oh, well, it's everywhere. What am I going to do? And I get that feeling. It's a normal reaction to the fact that this stuff has been found in floss and children's products and all of these different things. That's just more of a reason to try to fight state by state and then to the federal level for making this so that it's buying toxic consumer products is just not an option.
My thanks to Alden Wicker for coming on the show, and to Vasco Kostovsky for our audio engineering. There are links to Alden's book and her other writing in the podcast blurb, and do remember to visit our website, www.landclimate.org, for more articles and podcasts on this issue. If you are enjoying the Land and Climate podcast, please subscribe and leave a review on your favourite platform, and tune back in 2 weeks' time to hear Alistair talk to Lund University's Jonas Algers about decarbonising the steel industry. Thanks for listening.